and hopefully one that's not too ominous and chilling of free speech. We'll see. Think what you wish. Welcome to the Chai95 Radio Hour on WWDB 860 AM in Philadelphia and streaming on the web at www.dbam.com. I'm your host, Adam Taxin. This show ties into the Chai95.com website. That's CHAI95.com. And yes, that is a pun on the highway I-95 because, after all, what we're trying to offer with our limited resources is from Maine to Miami, news and views that Jews with clues can use. Last Tuesday, I mentioned Michael Savage's new nonfiction book, Trickle Tyranny, Crushing Obama's Dream of the Socialist States of America, which had just been released that morning. From the brief glimpse I had at that point, some things about the book were immediately clear, and I had seen enough to describe the book as a sobering wake-up call and something Dr. Savage, the nation's #1 Jewish radio host for a long time, continuing to the present time, something that for him seemed less like a labor of love and something more that he wrote as a labor of duty. A more formal review of the book is forthcoming, but I did have a chance to spend some time with the book over the first 2 days of Passover this past weekend. I read it this weekend not with any sort of agenda, but simply because I finally had some time. Unexpectedly, I saw some connections, perhaps disturbing connections, between the Passover story and what was in Trickle Tyranny. Let me give you something Savage writes in his chapter called Tyranny of the Treasurer, something he writes about Obama's henchmen, and he's talking about financially. He writes, "By the time they're done running up debt, printing money, and raising taxes, all but the wealthiest will be reduced to poverty and dependence on our government." Now, those familiar with the story of the Exodus know that there's a lot more to it than the all of 7 or so lines in the Passover Haggadah, which we read at the Seders, between the beginning of the discussion of the oppressing of the Hebrews, which starts with the line, "The Egyptians did evil to us and afflicted us." Between that line and "The Egyptians subjugated the children of Israel with hard labor. We cried out to Hashem, the God of our fathers, and Hashem heard our cry and saw our affliction, our burden and our oppression." To editorialize a bit, in other words, the descent of individuals and groups from freedom into enslavement is usually much less sudden and much less dramatic than Kunta Kinte picking the wrong time to walk through the African forest. And for younger listeners, that's a reference to the 1970s miniseries Roots. There's usually an economic situation involved, whether it's related to pure economic circumstances or a devious plan by the government powers that be. And with that in mind, let me read something from Yosef Deutsch's Talmud and Midrash-based book, Let My Nation Go, the story of the exodus of the Jewish nation from Egyptian bondage. Taxes. Pharaoh was delighted with the idea. He issued a decree imposing very heavy taxes on the Jewish residents of Egypt. There was no escape. Slowly but surely, all the wealth of the Jews was drained away until finally they were all left destitute. Starvation stared them in the face, and still the Egyptian tax collectors demanded their heavy payments. "Just because you have no money doesn't exempt you from paying your fair share." You hear that, listeners? Fair share. One more time. Fair share. "Just because you have no money doesn't exempt you from paying your fair share of the taxes," the Egyptians told them. "But we have a solution for you. We have employment available on many of our construction projects. You can work for us, and we will pay you for your work. Then you'll have money with which to pay your taxes, and who knows, maybe you'll even have something left for food for your children." And let me add, there were no massive government unions back then. Back to the text, the Jewish people had no choice but to agree to this arrangement. The Egyptian master plan to inflict unbelievable suffering on the Jews was beginning to take form. The crushing tax burden was leading to the exploitation of the Jews as laborers, and all in a cunning fashion that avoided a public outcry by the Jews. Pharaoh felt sure he could outsmart the Jews and prevent them from becoming a powerful nation. So, let me go back to something else Dr. Savage says in his Tyranny of the Treasurer chapter. He also writes, Obama is determined to turn the U.S. into the next Cuba. 80% of Cuba's workforce is employed by the Cuban government. And Dr. Savage also writes, it's crony capitalism at its most destructive, designed to concentrate all the power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. So, I'd like to think my listeners are intelligent and that plenty have, these last few days, given much thought to the Passover story and themes of freedom and slavery. So I'll leave it to listeners to read between the lines of what I just read. The books I mentioned, again, are Yosef Deutsch's Let My Nation Go, the story of the exodus of the Jewish nation from Egyptian bondage, and that can be found, among other places, at artscroll.com, and Michael Savage's Trickle Down Tyranny, Crushing Obama's Dream of the Socialist States of America. And that can pretty much be found everywhere at the moment, except where it's already sold out or where Stalinist-type bookstore employees are violating contracts by purposely hiding the book. Anyhow, let me now welcome in studio Bob Gazzardi, my co-host today and the editor of the Liberty Blog, thelibertyblog.org. Bob, welcome.